Hi, I'm JP and you're watching the Coffee Channel. Today we're talking about Nespresso capsules, or to be more precise, Nespresso compatible capsules. Now, what's the difference? Well, Nespresso was a thing that was invented in the 1970s and it was originally intended for the office market. By the 80s, commercial machines had been produced that could be used in the home, but they were rather clunky devices that still had a portafilter that you had to put the pod into. However, by the late 90s and early noughties, we have machines like this one here, which are fairly slim, small, easy to use, and can be put into any home environment with no problem at all. 2011, the patent expired for the Nespresso capsule, which opened the market to a lot of specialty roasters, which is really important for us because actually, to be fair, Nespresso capsules from Nespresso are pretty poor quality, if you ask me. They're over roasted, the coffee's not great, they just don't taste very nice. I'm sorry if that upsets any Nespresso purists here, but there are lots of options on the market now from specialty roasters that are really good, and we're going to be looking at 4 options here: Grind, Horsham coffee, Colonna coffee, and Origin. We're going to taste these in a minute, but first we're going to have a little look at how the Nespresso machine works and how easy it is to use in any environment, home or office. There are many coffee purists out there who really don't like Nespresso machines. They don't like the fact that you can't control any of the parameters, you can't control the grind, you can't buy as much coffee, you can't just go out and buy from any roaster you like, stick it in there and get something that you've created yourself. It's very much controlled. On this machine you can change the temperature between 3 settings, but on most Nespresso machines you can't. You're just stuck with one temperature. The only thing you can really adjust is the length of time it takes to extract the coffee and how much water you're putting through the coffee. I can see their point, but the problem is buying an espresso machine and a grinder that are going to get you results that are drinkable at all is going to be way more than the cost of this Nespresso machine. So if you get something like a Gadget Classic, which is your sort of basic coffee machine for home use, espresso machine, that's going to cost you about £250. I wouldn't recommend a grinder under about £150, £200 either. You might be able to get it a little bit cheaper if you go second hand, but then you've got problems that it may break, etc. This machine here, just over £100, no mess, no messing around with grinds everywhere, no having an enormous grinder in your kitchen that your partner's going to get so annoyed with they're going to leave you, no grounds going all over the floor, going all over your worktop. It's really, really simple. There are some problems, but we'll come to those later. First of all, we're going to look at how this one works. So it's really simple. The genius of it is it heats up incredibly quickly. After about 1 minute, you're up to temperature. Something like our FB80 espresso machine here next to me, which is a commercial one, will take anywhere 20 minutes to 30 minutes. A home machine might take 10-15 minutes, a normal espresso machine. So they heat up really quickly, and all you do, once it's heated up, you pull the lid and you put your pod in here, push it down, press your button, and then it will extract your coffee, and when you pull the lid back up, pushes the empty pod into its own little bin. Now, there are a few other steps you have to make. We usually go for around 25 grams of coffee coming out at the end of the day in your cup. And you can set this fairly easily just by holding down the button that you want, in this case a short button, and letting it run for 25 grams with scales underneath it, and then pressing it again, and that will set the machine to deliver around 25 grams of coffee. It's not perfect. It can change, it does vary a little bit, as all volumetric machines do, even expensive ones. But that will give you a short espresso, which we're talking about today. There are other settings for a lungo and a medium coffee, but the type of pods we've got today are all designed to be used with the short setting, which should produce 25 grams of coffee in your cup. Now, that sounds something like a normal espresso. You might have anywhere from 20 grams to 40 grams of coffee in an espresso that you get from a coffee shop. And you think, well, that's fairly equivalent to what I'd make at home. The interesting thing here is, though, that there's far less coffee in your coffee. So there's far less actual strength of coffee in that espresso that you're getting. We'll have a look at this later, but basically all of these capsules here are around 5 grams of coffee, ground coffee inside them. Typically, when you make a coffee using an espresso machine and you make a double espresso, which is something that would give you between 20 and 40 grams, depending on what type of espresso you're making, you'd be putting anywhere from 15 to 20 grams of coffee in. So you'd be putting 3 to 4 times as much coffee in. So what you're getting is a more diluted drink. So it's like an espresso, but it's much less strong. There's much less coffee in that final drink than an espresso. So we've got to take that into consideration when we look at our drinks. On to the tasting challenge, and the first of our pods comes from Origin. They're a Cornwall-based roaster. They've been around for nearly 20 years. They're highly regarded in the coffee industry. They've had 2 UK barista champions in the last few years, so they really know what they're doing. We've gone for a pulped natural from Brazil, which is their house espresso. Going to make it now. 25 grams out. We've got the temperature set to maximum, which is what we want for a light roast coffee, which I assume this will be, but we'll take a closer look at that later on. Let's do the taste test. So now we're going to make an espresso with one of these pods, the Origin pod first. It's a pretty simple process. We've already set up our machine to be at the highest temperature. You can't do that on every Nespresso machine, but you can on this one. It's a fairly simple process. You can just see in the instruction manual if you've got one of these machines. All the other Nespresso machines, you can't do it, so don't worry about that. Got our pod, we open the lid. We've already set it to deliver 25 grams of coffee on the short setting. I've got the scales here anyway to just check how consistent it is in doing that. Then you press the short button, and about 25 seconds later, you will get your Nespresso espresso. Nothing much happens to begin with. It's just piercing the film of the pod, and water is starting to move in now with the pump, and you get a pretty quick extraction. Looks quite a lot like espresso, although somewhat thinner and with less crema. Any minute now, it's going to stop, and fairly close to 25 grams. It's not terribly consistent, to be honest. It's a good 2 or 3 grams either side, but enough for the purposes of this test. Now, question, how does it taste? Well, looking at it, as I said earlier, it looks like a double espresso, which it essentially is in terms of its actual weight, in terms of the quantity of fluid that we've got here. But in terms of the actual strength of the coffee, it's nowhere near. As I said earlier, we're looking at a coffee that's only got 5 grams of coffee dissolved in here. Even if that was 100% extraction, which it's not, it's around 20 to 25% extraction on this particular coffee, I believe. Whereas with your espresso machine, you'd be looking at having much more coffee in there. So, it feels pretty hot at the moment, so I'm going to give it a few seconds to cool down. We can take a little sniff of it. It smells like a normal espresso from someone like Origin. It doesn't smell roasty. It doesn't smell like a filter coffee. It smells like it's a fairly strong espresso type beverage. Okay. First sip. Okay, so we've got a bit of a nutty flavour there. A little bit chocolatey. It's not too roasty. It's actually not far off the taste you'd expect from a sort of Brazilian espresso. It's nowhere near as strong though. As I've said before, this is borne out in the actual taste. It's much more like a lungo, which you don't find in many coffee shops, but if you go to somewhere like Colonna and Smalls in Bath, they will serve you a lungo, which is usually something that's produced on about a 4:1 ratio of coffee to the final drink. So whereas in most specialty coffee shops you might be looking at 2:1 ratio, where they put 15 grams of coffee into their espresso machine and the espresso you get out is 30 grams, with a lungo you'd be looking at 15 grams going in and typically 60 grams coming out, so sort of 4:1 ratio. That means the drink is a little bit thinner, well, considerably thinner in fact, so you don't get the same mouthfeel as you do with an espresso where it's quite viscous and thick. And that's what this is like. The advantage of that is some of the flavours that you get are not overcome by the strength of the coffee, and the viscosity of it isn't overwhelming. So you can perceive a lot more of the subtle flavours, and this is actually quite floral. It's quite sweet, it's floral, it's got that sort of slightly marzipan-y taste at the back. It doesn't taste actually that much like a pulp natural Brazilian, which typically would be much more chocolatey, nutty. There's a bit of nuttiness in there, but it tastes more to me like an Ethiopian coffee. I'm quite surprised. If I had that as a blind tasting, I wouldn't say that was from Brazil. That's a nice espresso actually. It's got plenty of balance, it's nice and sweet. I don't think it would work terribly well with a lot of milk. I think it would get lost in there. So if you're into making milk drinks, which some Nespresso machines have some sort of milk steamer or a separate milk steamer on the side, or some people buy milk steamers that are standalone ones. I think Duolet make one called the Chino. I think you probably need to put a couple of these in, even if you're making something like 5 or 6 ounces, like a flat white, to make it cut through. So as an espresso, I like this. As an espresso to put in a milk drink, I think you'd have to probably make something like a piccolo with equal amounts milk and espresso, like you would in this particular glass cup. Okay, that's the origin. On to the next one. On to coffee number 2, which is from London-based roasters and coffee shop chain Grind. Now these guys, I recall having coffee shops in London, Shoreditch originally. I remember passing them. I've never been into one of them, bizarrely enough. I've been into most coffee shops in London over the years, but I've not been into any of the Grind coffee shops. During the pandemic, they moved over to producing a B2C coffee model. So they were doing pods, doing roasted coffee for consumers, which they didn't do, I believe, before that point. Now, I've extracted the coffee already, same process as the previous one. As you can see, the crema's dissipated a little bit by now, but actually it had more crema than the origin. I suspect it's a darker roast, and I can smell from the coffee itself, this smells actually quite dark for my tastes. We chose the light blend because there are a few choices. There was an espresso blend, there was a light blend, there was a dark roast blend. I'm not a fan of dark roast coffees. I think that they disguise any of the flavours of the coffee itself with this sort of generic roastiness, this kind of toasty flavour. I know some people like it, sometimes cuts through a bit more in milk if you've got a darker coffee, but in general it really isn't my thing. I do not like it at all. So I do approach this coffee with a little bit of trepidation. I was expecting something to smell a lot lighter than this. So it should have sufficiently cooled by now. Let's have our first taste. Okay, so there's quite a lot of roastiness there actually. Much more roastiness than I'd expect from a specialty roaster, specialty coffee shop. Oh, and they're light coffee. Let's try again. So it's that bitter flavour, that bitter, the roasty, toasty sort of flavour that reminds me of sort of old school coffees you used to get from Italian coffee shops in the 90s and before then. It's a very dark roast. I can't lie. I can't really perceive that many flavours beneath it. Now, it may work better with milk, and we may have to try that later on because as it is, I don't think I can drink the whole of that. It really is not to my taste. It's just too dark, it's too bitter. Not very good, unfortunately. Moving on to our third coffee, and this is from Sussex-based roasters Horsham, who are the epitome of a sort of small roastery, very small team of people. They've got a couple of coffee shops. I think they've only got 5 people working for them in the roastery itself, so not a big player, but they're producing these pods like some of the other companies out there. They're a specialty roaster that I've used in the past actually, so I know what their coffee tastes like. I've always been pretty happy with the flavour of their coffee. So I'll be interested to see how this translates to an espresso pod. We've chosen Like the others, we've gone with the house espresso, the cheapest one in the range, and this one is Rwandan. Notes of orange, caramel, that type of thing on the label. So we're going to have a little taste, see what it comes out like. So smell wise, again, it doesn't smell like a dark roast. It's more like the Origin in terms of its smell. Remarkably like a typical light roast specialty espresso really in terms of its aromas. It's not dark. It's got a fairly decent crema there. More so than the Origin, I'd say, but probably not quite as big as the one from Grind. Let's have a taste. Okay, that's actually quite flavoursome. That's more to me like an espresso taste in terms of the flavours. It's got more zing than the Origin. It almost tastes like a natural. There's a bit more acidity in there, a bit less floral. This may just be the actual coffee itself rather than any sort of roasting process or how it's been chosen. The Origin tasted a particular way, probably because of the beans that were chosen to be used in it. Let's have another taste. Okay, plenty of fruit there, kind of citrus fruits. Very sweet actually. Again, it's not really like an espresso in full. It doesn't have that mouthfeel of an espresso. Again, it's a bit like a lungo, but it's got a lot of flavour. I really quite like that actually. I'd be happy to have something that tasted like that as a lungo in a coffee shop. It's pretty well balanced. There's not an overpowering acidity there. It's sweet and it's well balanced. I like it. On to the final coffee, which is from Colonna Coffee. Now, Maxwell Colonna Dashwood was one of the pioneers of specialty Nespresso pods. I can remember talking to him about it years and years ago when he came up with the idea. I thought it was crazy. So, as I say in other videos where we feature Colonna stuff, there is a bit of a conflict of interest in the sense that I do know the owner, but I'm not going to let that make me anything less than impartial. I'm going to try this as if I was tasting any other coffee from anyone else. Now, Colonna, as you may know, is a coffee shop in Bath and a roaster just outside of Bath. Maxwell, the owner, has been multiple UK Barista Champion, and he's got the World Barista Championship final 3 times, finished in the top 6 3 times. He really knows what he's talking about when it comes to coffee. So it'll be interesting to see how this tastes, because actually the Opal one that we're using here was a coffee machine that he helped design, which is why it's got the adjustable temperatures and which is why we set it to the highest temperature, because that is what works best with light roast coffee. And the peak water we're using for the water in the machine is also from his design of coffee filter. So he's got a bit of a hand in this game altogether. So maybe a bit of an unfair advantage. But we're using his foundation coffee here, which is again is the cheapest of his Nespresso capsules. In this case, it's a red honey coffee from Peru. Now, if you don't know what a honey processed coffee is, it's nothing to do with honey itself. It's just a name given to coffees that are a bit like the natural process, except that varying degrees of the skin of the cherry and the mucilage are taken off before fermentation. So it's kind of a cross between a wash coffee and a natural coffee, a bit like a pulp natural coffee in a way. So we're expecting some of those sort of fruity acidic flavours in here. I'm expecting it to be quite nicely balanced as other Colonna coffees have been. In fact, I've got a very similar coffee to this from Colonna on the espresso machine at the moment, so it'll be interesting to compare in a minute how the grind and how the taste compares to those two. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so we've got less crema than with the other coffees. The crema's dissipated quite quickly. What we've got is a very clean tasting coffee, lots of upfront fruit. Again, it's got almost like that filter coffee taste to it more than that sort of espresso thickness. It might disappear a bit in milk, like the other coffees that we've had apart from the grind, which I think were cut through milk purely by being so dark. This one I don't think will work amazingly well with milk unless you use a very small quantity of milk with it. But as a black coffee, it's actually very clean. Lots of flavour, sort of red apple acidity, a tiny bit of that sort of boozy flavour in there, a bit of cherryness. It's actually pretty good, although I am getting onto my 4th coffee now and I'm starting to feel quite caffeinated, so my judgment is probably not as good as earlier on in the video. But I do like this. Let's think about which one we consider to be the winner in a minute. So, I've tasted all 4 coffees and I have chosen a winner. But before I give you my winner, we can have a quick look at what's actually inside these capsules and how they work. So I'm going to open them up with my Stanley knife here. First of all, the grind one. Taking care not to slice my hand open. We'll see here that actually it's fairly dark, as I expected. It's a fairly dark roast. I'd say somewhere beyond medium, and certainly darker than most specialty coffees. Okay, second we have got the Origin coffee. And I expect this one to be significantly lighter. Let's have a little look at that. And yeah, it's a shade lighter actually, not massively lighter, surprisingly. Okay, going on to the Horsham coffee. And we'll see that's pretty much similar to the Origin. And lastly, the Colonna, which is the lightest of the 4. Now it's interesting, if you look at this, what we've got here is a very, very consistent grind. These are usually done on roller grinders these days rather than on actual burr grinders like we use in a coffee shop. I think in the early days of these capsules being made, they're ground on EK43s like we've got here. These days they're ground on big roller grinders, which gives a really, really consistent grind. The actual coarseness is relatively coarse on all of them, certainly much coarser than we'd use for espresso here. In fact, I've got some Colonna coffee here that we were making earlier on our own machine, and actually if you see, it's a little bit lighter. It's not exactly the same coffee as this one here, but it's very similar, and it's actually roasted a little bit lighter. They're probably a shade lighter. Now, out of these, I'm actually surprised that the Horsham and the Origin are this dark. They don't taste that dark. That's a medium roast. This actually tastes darker, the grind coffee, than it looks. It's significantly darker than our standard Colonna. It's a little bit darker than the Colonna that we've had in the Nespresso capsule. But the grind on all of these is incredibly even, and that's how the Nespresso machine is able to extract a really even, high extraction coffee from a very small, cheap machine. Okay, so we've looked at that. What do I think about a winner? Well, I think we have something of a tie, but we'll get to that in a minute. In last place, unsurprisingly, is the grind. It's just too dark for me. I really don't like the flavours. They're just overpowered by that roastiness. It's almost like the flavour of kind of an instant coffee. It just doesn't taste good at all. Might be better in milk. We may look at that in a future episode. In third place, and it's a toss-up between third, second and first, to be honest, but in third place I would say the Origin. It's a nice coffee. It's got plenty of flavour. It's a little bit floral for my liking. It doesn't cut through as much as the other coffees here, but it's still a nice coffee. In joint first place, we're going to say the Colonna and the Horsham. To be honest, the Horsham probably just edges it for me. It's just got a little bit more flavour. a little bit more acidity. It seems to have a little bit more structure and body to it. So although the Colonna has that nice acidity, it's very similar and it's hard to separate them. Thinking about it now, I'm going to go with the Horsham. That's my favourite coffee by an absolute minutest margin. The Horsham coffee is my favourite Nespresso from these 4 specialty roasters. Thanks for watching. If you liked our videos, like and subscribe. We'll have some more coming soon.